Good afternoon. Welcome to Cornell Silicon Valley Shop Talk featuring Sandy Khaund. This is sponsored by Cornell's West Coast Alumni Affairs and this is Cornell Silicon Valley. So thank you for joining us. I will be your moderator today, if you will. My name is Colleen Cahill. I'm part of Cornell's West Coast team based in Oakland is where I am. I'm part of the Alumni Affairs and Development. For today, our goal is to build a connection with alumni, current students. It's wonderful to have you here, friends, and if we have any parents. We have an entire Alumni Affairs and Development team that works from San Diego up through Seattle. So Cornell does have a huge presence on the West Coast, which is awesome. And now, by way of introduction, we have Sandy Khaund, who I personally love. Sandy is an entrepreneur, a mentor, an investor, and a long-distance runner. Sandy's career has included positions in large corporate environments and multiple startup endeavors. Today, Sandy is the founder and CEO of Macrodemic, a startup accelerator for startup companies. He's also a general partner at Mindspring Capital, a globally oriented early-stage investment firm that empowers technology ventures in the sports industry, and he's also an angel investor. So Sandy is very, very busy in life. Sandy earned his Bachelor's of Science and his MEng from Cornell. He got a BA in physics from Ithaca College and an MBA from Wharton.
So as Colleen mentioned, I actually did a 3-2 program with Ithaca College and Cornell. In fact, my old roommate from those years, Michael Roth, is on here as well. So we actually spent 3 years at Ithaca, 2 years at Cornell, got bachelors from both, and then I stuck around the extra year for the master. So not a typical experience, but 6 years in Ithaca, New York, which was just right. Another year, and I probably would have gone crazy, but had fun for the 6 I was there. So just kind of my life in a nutshell, and Colleen touched on a little bit of it, but to add some more color and do it really fast. When I graduated, I actually was about to do a PhD at the University of Virginia, realized that I didn't want to spend any more time in school. So I ended up going to work for Lockheed Martin, which was actually near home in East Windsor, New Jersey. It was exciting. I was a rocket scientist. It was really cool. Didn't impress girls, but it was really cool. Spent about 6 months there. Turned out it wasn't really that cool. It was the middle of the ending of the Cold War. No one was really excited about a lot of the stuff that was built there. So I decided to come west and work for Intel. And Intel was the absolute perfect time. Pentiums were being household words. Everybody's getting email addresses. It was really exciting. Started on chip design, realized software was my love. So eventually moved over to the developer relations group, worked on John Madden football, Tiger Woods golf, optimizing them for Intel platforms. Really enjoyed that, but kind of recognized that I'm an entrepreneur at heart. So I started a company called Active CD. The good news, I was, doing some really cool stuff and I was finally being an entrepreneur. The bad news, I was a pioneer. I was the first of the failed .coms, so I guess maybe that's good news or bad news. But so I did what all failures do. And I went back to school to try again and learn. That's when I went to Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, went back east to Philadelphia, spent my summer working for the Boston Consulting Group in management consulting, because they tell every MBA, it's all about consulting or investment banking. And after I gave the 5 minutes of thought to investment banking, I'm like, no, consulting. Did that and realized I didn't want to make PowerPoint for the rest of my life, with all due respect to the good people at BCG. And that's when Microsoft came calling, and it turned out to be a great time. Microsoft was the IT company back in 2001. Spent 6 years there watching what made it the IT company, which was Office and Windows, go down the tubes, but also saw enterprise computing, which makes it what it is today, kind of become this huge business. And I was there at the beginning of cloud computing and a lot of the stuff on the enterprise side. A lot of fun, learned a lot, but wanted to come back down to California after spending 6 weeks or 6 years. Felt like 6 weeks, it went so fast. But spending 6 years in Seattle, came down to California. I became the SVP of a company called Pixo, which was a startup doing social networking for teens, particularly teen girls. I didn't understand teen girls when I was a teen boy. I don't understand teen girls now that I have almost 2 of them, or about to have 2 of them. Didn't understand it then, but it was social networking. It was a great way to learn about what was going on in Silicon Valley. Eventually moved into the COO role there. Got my first chance to kind of raise money at the Silicon Valley level, which was a very fascinating experience. But after about a year there, I'm like, I need to move on. And I tried starting my second company, which was EdTech, basically distance learning on a mobile phone. This was just after the iPhone SDK came out. And I just was fascinated with the iPhone, wrote the code myself, released the V1, did a number of really interesting deals, including doing some stuff with Cornell, doing some stuff with MIT, with Khan Academy, if you're familiar with Khan Academy. The good news, we won a lot of really cool awards. We were Fast Company's top 10 ed tech companies. We won a bunch of other awards. Apparently, I was nominated for a World Technology Award. I don't know what that means, but it sounded cool. So I liked it.
Sounds very cool.
My dad thought it was cool. So that was kind of nice. But at the same time, ed tech's not a very easy business to go into. So I kind of waved the white flag and decided I had to go get a real job, as I like to call it. Went to work for Turner Broadcasting. That was awesome. It got me into the media space. I got to work with CNN, got to work with Cartoon Network and TBS. And of course, Turner Sports, being a huge sports fan, was like just heaven for me. So spent 3 years kind of working with startups who wanted to work with Turner, as well as working with some of the biggest companies like Google, Apple, Twitter. We actually did the, it seems trite now, but we did the CNN app for Google Glass, which was one of the most popular apps for Google Glass. I know now that seems like a goofy thing, but back in 2013, we were kind of—
I remember 2013 being a big deal. Yeah.
Exactly. It was cutting edge, right? So did that for 3 years, and then they were kind of winding down the San Francisco office, and I didn't want to move to Atlanta. So I took a job with a company called In Stadium. In Stadium was a network of 450 professional college sports venues. Really cool stuff because it's sports, right? I get to go to games and everything like that. Unfortunately, they were a Chicago marketing private equity led company. I'm more of a tech San Francisco VC kind of guy. So it was a little bit of an impedance mismatch. But what it did do was give me sort of the opportunity to see what was going on with ticketing and why ticketing was failing. What I kind of recognized is that I'd been introduced to the blockchain about a year or two earlier, saw some of the basics of what made that kind of really interesting. All of a sudden I saw how it could apply to ticketing. I always kind of say it's my Reese's peanut butter cup moment, like the chocolate and the peanut butter. I presented to international audience. So like, what the heck are you talking about? What Reese's moment? So I've realized, so for anybody here internationally, it was a common commercial back when some of us were kids, where it's like, you get the chocolate and the peanut butter and peanut butter and chocolate. Anyway, that was blockchain was the peanut butter and ticketing was the chocolate, put it together, created this company again, like my previous startup, wrote the code V1, got everything going, got kind of eyeballs deep in blockchain, which when you're staring at a screen with a bunch of hexadecimal digits after a while, it did feel a little bit like college at times, but it was fun, sort of. Anyway, did that for about 2 years. It went pretty well. Ultimately, in early 2018, Ticketmaster came along, originally said they wanted to invest. Ultimately, they decided to acquire us. That closed at the end of 2018. So it was actually a very fast turnaround, a very exciting turnaround. It was only about 2 years from when we incorporated to when we had the letter of intent. Spent about 18 months at Ticketmaster. It was a great time pushing blockchain. So trying to get an old dog to learn new tricks. A company with a 40-year-old system and trying to get it to kind of integrate with the blockchain. That was awesome. But at the same time, as you can imagine, 2020, baseball was played in front of empty stadiums, basketball and hockey were in a bubble, and everybody stopped their tours. So Ticketmaster basically came to a halt. I like to say we had negative revenue, not negative profits, negative revenue. We had to give money back to people.
Wow.
So it was not a good time for business at that time. So basically by the end of the summer, I rolled out of there, and that's where I am now. So I'm doing, and Colleen, you mentioned a couple of the jobs, but so I'm working with Macrodemic, which is a startup studio, and I can explain more about that later. I'm at Mindspring Capital, so I get to be an investor. I get to sit on the other side of the table, which is always kind of fun. I am also an angel investor, so I do some investments on the side. And then I'm also on the board of directors of MakerDow, which is a decentralized finance or DeFi cryptocurrency, which right now with all the insane valuations that are going on, it's kind of like, I keep looking at Coinbase and I'm like, this can't be real, but it is. And I'm learning a ton just being around sort of the cryptocurrency side of it, as opposed to the ticketing and smart contract side that I did before. And that's kind of me. That's
where you got to take. Oh my goodness, there's so many different directions we can take this. You've got Mindspring, you've got Macrodemic, you've got the blockchain side. Kate, do you want to, I would really be curious to see what the poll gave us. Thank you. Okay, which investment sectors are most promising? That seems to be, and what a venture investor looks for in a company. You seem to be, okay, you seem to be the big winners. I'm gonna, should I hit share results? Is that how this works? I guess this is how this works. I'm very professional at Zoom, as you can tell. Okay, so which makes me think then, all right, let's talk about Mindspring Capital. So when people are thinking about, and when you're thinking about assessing companies and what does and does not get funded, because I'm sure a lot of companies are in front of you, trying to get in front of you, seeking funds. How do you make that assessment? Who gets your funds and who doesn't? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and it's kind of an iterative process, but the first thing you look for when you get a deck or when you have that original meeting, and I always kind of say it comes down to the 3 T's, right? So team, traction, and technology, right? Everybody talks about, like, you want to invest in the right jockey, you want to kind of put the money in the right individuals, because at the end of the day, the business can change, but the humans can't. So you want to make sure you have the right people. Do they have the right background? Do they have the right domain expertise? Do you trust them to take your money and do something interesting with it? There's almost an integrity thing that you're eventually going to test for. And that's the one that you can read on paper early on, where did they work before? Where did they go to school? What were their experiences and everything like that? But then on top of that, it's sort of like, that's where the iterative process of meeting them and meeting them again and a third time is really important, because you want to make sure you have a rapport with them. You want to make sure that they can learn and they can adapt. So teams an automatic one. The greatest idea in the world with the wrong team, and it will fail, even if it's the greatest idea in the world. The traction part is, is this product out in market? Are people actually using it? Is there something to say that, like, you can't just be, if we build it, they will come. You actually want it to be out there, and you want some validation that customers not only will use it, but there will be money that ultimately comes in, even if it's for the customer for free. Somehow it's going to have to get subsidized by sponsors, by anybody else. And what you need to do is make sure that there actually is people who will pay for the audience, or the audience that pays for the product. And some initial validation of that is really important. And then the technology itself. And again, we're talking about tech startups. There's a lot of other startups out there that I'd even look to invest in that aren't tech. But the important thing about the idea of assessing the technology is that, is it unique? Is it defensible? Is it something that somebody else, particularly a big player, couldn't just come in 2 minutes and snap it up? And I always say that, as much as I just said big player, I'm almost more concerned about the 2 students in a Cornell dorm room or in a Stanford dorm room that's going to rip me off than I ever was about Ticketmaster building the blockchain for ticketing, going back to my experience, because ultimately Ticketmaster couldn't do it. It's why they bought us. It's why everybody was like, well, why wouldn't Ticketmaster do this? And I'm like, they can. And everybody's like, yeah, they can. I'm like, they can. I was proven right. But the 2 gals in the dorm room can absolutely do that. They have nothing to lose, and they have all the information and knowledge in the world. And so that's where you have to look at it and say, this is defensible. This isn't easy to replicate, and we can move fast on it, that by the time they get wind of it and they try to do with it, we're going to be able to move faster. We're going to be able to subsidize the growth of this company to the point that they're going to kind of get into that next orbit.
So you mentioned the team being important. I'm curious, currently that's all being assessed virtually, right? Because of the COVID pandemic. Has that changed how you assess or how people should present themselves as a team? How does that change the playing field?
It's a great question. It's really hard because there's something, like, I personally, even in this conversation, there's only so many people that you can see and the connection you make. And I always say that when I'm physically across from someone, it's easier to kind of get a read on people. It's easier to have that conversation. On Zoom, it kind of makes it a little bit artificial and broken. So are you getting a real read on the individual on the other side of the table who's bringing the product? And so unfortunately, I think the ability for us to assess effectively goes down in a Zoom environment. And I'd even say that with some of the companies that we've invested in at Mindspring, I believe at least one partner has met every one of the entrepreneurs that we've invested in, or basically is in our pipeline. We have 2 or 3 companies that are about to come through, and that helps us, right? So in fact, one of them I knew before he had come to Mindspring. So I'm like, this guy is legit. He's smart, he's talented, and he's charismatic, and it comes through even better off of Zoom than on Zoom. But with the ones that we just meet on Zoom, I'm a little bit more hesitant to kind of pull the trigger because I just don't know if I have enough confidence or faith unless someone I trust has vetted it. And that's also where referrals become a really important thing, because the truth is that usually I will only take meetings with people that were referred to me, that it's like, hey, Sandy, you got to meet so-and-so. She's awesome. You're going to love her. And I'm like, okay, if you say so, I trust you. And then you kind of carry and you draft off of that recommendation. I think that's the same sort of thing here. You look for the opportunity for someone to validate it if you can, almost by proxy.
So how do you think people could maybe use their Cornell connections then to help build that referral process?
I think, the one thing I love about Cornell, the many things I love about Cornell, but one of the things I really, truly love about Cornell is I do think that there's a communal spirit of anybody who's gone to Cornell, anybody's ever experienced, the hill and the weather and the winters. And quick story, but I still remember I was at South by Southwest a few years ago. I was judging a startup competition. And right before I sat down, the organizer of the competition, Startup South by Southwest, comes up to me, and he does one of those things where you try to like talk but be discreet. He's like, and he kind of doesn't move his mouth. He's like, "You're sitting next to Robert Smith," and I'm like, "What?" He's like, "You're sitting next." He's like, "You're sitting next to Robert Smith," and I'm like, "Okay." And he's like, "You don't know who Robert Smith is?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Robert Smith is the second wealthiest Black person in America. I think it was like Oprah, Robert Smith, and Michael Jordan. I think he may have moved ahead of Oprah.
Wow.
That's at all possible." I'm like, okay, I should probably look this up. So he wasn't there yet. I sit down, I pull him up. He's got a Wikipedia entry, so he's got to be legit, right? And all of a sudden I see he went to Cornell for undergrad. And so I'm like, all right, I got to work this into a conversation. So it's me, him, and one other judge. And at some point I'm like talking and telling about myself. And I'm like, oh, I went to Cornell. And I tried to play like I didn't know he did. Like, oh, yeah, I went to Cornell. We talked for the next 15 minutes. And the guy to the left of me, who was a Harvard Business School graduate, so he can go to hell, right? But he's just like, at some point he's like, God, the Cornell Mafia, you guys like connect in all the places. And I'm like, yes, that's right. We have, and he did feel an extra kinship to me because we had shared this experience. And I think, getting back to your question, I think the idea of when people reach out to me from Cornell, and I know we may talk about Wagey later, which is something that I did last year with a bunch of Cornell students, but a lot of the students that weren't part of the program that I was creating still reached out to me and said, hey, can I just get 45 minutes of your time? And I'm like, absolutely. Like, I was in your position years and years and many years ago. And I understand how important it is to have that conversation. In fact, I had one yesterday with somebody from the vet school that has this really cool idea. Spoke to him last July, and then he hit me up literally 2 weeks ago. I was like, hey, can we talk again? I have some, absolutely, like almost anything for a Cornell person. And I was on, they had the entrepreneurship at Cornell weekend last weekend or Friday. And I was judging a startup competition there. And one of the guys that was a judge with me was Dan Crane, who's the founder of Blackboard. And he said something, and it just kind of tripped a wire in me when he said it. And I don't think he realized how big a deal it was. But he said that when he was at Cornell, David Duffield, founder of PeopleSoft, founder of Workday, had come and basically said, like, you can do it. And that inspired him. And it's sort of like just the kind word and the right word to like that next generation is really valuable. And for me, and for a lot of other alums that are out there, I don't doubt Michael fits in this as well, like that's an important thing for us to help the next generation, to help the next wave and pay it forward so that they do it as well. So I think if you're in the Cornell alumni network, whether you're younger, whether you're older, everybody wants to help each other out. Everybody wants to help each other succeed, A, because it's the right thing to do, and B, every success of a Cornell person is a success for all of us. Don't think I didn't parade around Ruth Bader Ginsburg for the last 20,
yes.
30 years. Come on, right?
So good. Okay, so this will be my last question, and then we're going to open up to the audience. And so audience, please be thinking about what questions you might have. Also, you have a blockchain expert here, so any Dogecoin questions, I'm going to but I think my next actually formal question though, so the Wagey that you mentioned, you gave students an opportunity last summer. And as you're talking about giving back and mentoring, can you tell us a little about what inspired you to do so, and maybe a little about what that was about for you? And for
absolutely.
yeah.
I was actually slated to go back to speak to a couple of classes at Cornell last April. So of course, timing, how bad can that be? And I was really excited about it because it would have been the 25th anniversary since I left Cornell. And so come back sort of the prodigal son. And then when it was canceled, I did a lot of self-wallowing of like, woe is me. And then I started thinking a little bit more about the students and what was going on with them and some of the seniors or some of the other people that were like, their college education just got screwed up to a certain degree. And then I thought about the Cornell students, and I imagine if this had happened when I was a student. And one of the things that was really important, I was on a scholarship to Cornell. A lot of my tuition funds were kind of put off, but my brother was also in medical school. My mom wasn't working. We had really tight financial needs. And so the summer internships that I spent at Lockheed Martin were actually really important to be able to cover tuition, to be able to help my dad. And I realized, oh my God, and then I still had loans out the wazoo, right? When people complain about student loans, it's like, let me tell you about student loans. But with that said, I kind of imagined, okay, student loans are as bad as they are right now. A lot of kids are going to be hurting and they're losing their summer internships, because I knew Ticketmaster, we had cut our summer internship program. I knew some other people that had lost it. And I kind of said, hey, there might be an opportunity for me to do something interesting here. What if, and this was literally like cobbled together at the last minute. In retrospect, I'm so happy that it worked out as well as it did. But what if we created a program, and for people who lost their internships, for people who have student loans and needed a way to defray them, we'll just spend a summer. I will pay you, just start a business. Try starting a business, screw up now. You're 20, you're 21. This is the perfect time to screw up. No one will know. No one will remember. I did it at 27. It's still fine that the first script was at 27. But with that said, it would have been even better if I'd had the opportunity to do it over a summer. And it was sort of the make lemonade out of lemons sort of spirit. And we called it Weiji. And the idea of Weiji was, it's the Chinese character that kind of means crisis, but loosely translated also means opportunity. How do you take the crisis and turn it into an opportunity? So spun it out to a number of schools here and there. Thank you, Colleen. You helped me kind of get it to the Cornell entrepreneurship community. Got a ton of applications that came in. Basically took about half of them and said, hey, you're finalists and I want to talk to you. Did the interview process. And then within that said, okay, these are the 6 entrepreneurs. Gave them each a stipend, non-dilutive. I didn't want any piece of the business or anything like that. And then every week from sort of the beginning of June until I think the end of July, on Sunday mornings, Sunday mornings, my time, early afternoon, East Coast time, we'd have guest speakers come in and talk to the students. In addition, myself and Sean Brannigan, who's a professor up at Syracuse, who does a lot of media entrepreneurship stuff, along with my youngest daughter, Robin, who's kind of engaged with it. The 3 of us just ran the program. She didn't have the one-on-ones with them, but Sean and I did, where we talked them through different opportunities, work with them. And I kept reminding them, I'm like, I'm not investing, but I'm not putting the money in the business. I'm putting in the money in you. This is as much about self-discovery as it is about creating, Google or, Facebook or something like that. And that's where, for me, it was an incredibly redemptive process, because it was an opportunity to give back. It was an opportunity to give these people the experience. Still in touch with all of them. In fact, I've got a call with another one of them tomorrow morning. I was judging the competition contest. I've been judging a lot of startup competitions last Saturday because she's doing this global initiative with a bunch of businesses in Kenya and Nigeria. And so the fact that I can stay in their lives and be part of it, that's incredibly redeeming. The idea that I was able to give them something out of the summer so they don't remember the summer of 2020 as being an all bad experience. All those things kind of conspired for me to try to do it, and is why I kind of look back at that as probably one of the best things that happened last year.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. We are very proud to have you as a Cornell grad. Okay, we are going to open it up to the audience. Raise your virtual hand, or we can unmute you. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. Sandy has had many different companies, and he knows a lot about a lot of different areas, from blockchain to investing to angel investing and all the rest. So please do not be shy. Feel free to ask a question. If you don't, I'll throw some more to him. But yes, does anyone have anything? Or you can type it in the chat if you're nervous. That's also fine. Michael, do you have a question or do you have a?
I'll ask a question if it's okay, Sandy. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the future of sports and technology, especially as we emerge out of the pandemic. But if you look in the crystal ball, what do you think are some of the next big or exciting things to come with sports and tech and marketing?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Michael. So Macrodemic, which is my company right now, which is a startup studio, is dedicated to sports tech, partly because I do think the playing field's so fertile right now for opportunities. And I feel like the tech's not going to drive the business. The business is going to drive the tech, but the business is going through so many fundamental changes right now. Because if you think about legalized betting is one example of what's going to change sports fundamentally over the next 5 years. The use of college athletes on name, image, and likeness, so they're actually going to be able to profit off of their success, which I've kind of been on a warpath about, because I feel like the rules in the past have been disproportionately affecting women over men, because women athletes kind of have their peak of their notoriety when they're in college oftentimes, whereas a Trevor Lawrence, who was a great player at Clemson University, is going to be a bigger name when he's in the NFL, and he's going to make his money there. So that's going to change the landscape of how technology can support that. Social justice, right? The idea that we went from getting upset at Colin Kaepernick for kneeling to actually literally having "I can't breathe" written on the back of jerseys, right? Each of these things is going to fundamentally change what we expect from sports, what we expect from the sports experience. When you start sprinkling some of the technologies on around it, whether it's virtual reality and how virtual reality changes training, player tracking, and Internet of Things that actually can determine where you are on the field and where the ball is on the field and how that changes. In fact, right now, baseball, I'm a huge baseball fan. Baseball is a very different sport than it was 15 years ago. And it was a very different sport 15 years ago than it was 15 years before that, because of technology, because of the fact that where 30 years ago, the only metric that you had for a pitcher was miles per hour. Now they talk about spin rate. Now they talk about, launch velocity on a hit ball. The physics of it, for nerds, this is awesome. This is heaven, because it's like, oh my God, this is numbers inside of numbers. It's a great book I read called The MVP Machine that literally is about how these modest players become fantastic players because they had the analytics to be able to really, truly look at the intrinsic performance of what they're doing. Sort of hey, you're actually not getting enough spin rate, and that's why the ball's on a flat plane. That's why you're giving up home runs all the time. And a modest player just changes one thing, changes the grip of the baseball, and suddenly he's an all-star. And so all these sorts of things are going to conspire to change what we watch, the way we watch it, how we watch it. But I do get more excited in some ways about what's happening off the field. And maybe that's because of my ticketing background and my media background. But the way we watch a game, what we look for in it. 15 years ago, fantasy sports changed football particularly. In fact, the NFL has probably made more money off of fantasy sports without running a league than anyone else, because people pay $300 for direct ticket, a Sunday ticket package that goes with DirecTV, not because they care about any of the other teams, but they have one specific player who's on their fantasy team. It's almost like gambling, pre-gambling, right? It's like, yeah, my favorite team is the San Francisco 49ers. I watch them all the time here. But Adrian Peterson of the Washington football team, I need him to gain 120 yards with a touchdown, or I lose to Billy, and man, he's going to rub it in. And you pay $300 to watch that stuff. No one could have predicted this 30 years ago. And I think that's the sort of thing, when betting comes in, when a lot of these other sort of changes come in, that's going to change sports in general, and tech's got to follow.
Okay, so talking about new technology, and one that definitely still confuses me to no end. I've got it a little bit, and one day we're going to have you back to give your 20-minute explanation on blockchain. So this is what your company was built off of with Ticketmaster, and there's so much hype around blockchain right now. Is it valid? Should all my latte money go into Dogecoin today? And so what excites you about the technology, and what is it going to mean for the world in the years and decades to come?
Yeah, and it's funny because I started a blockchain company in late 2015, early 2016. And I always said that 2016 was the year of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I would tell people blockchain, and they'd kind of give me the look of like, oh, I've heard about that. Isn't that kind of crazy voodoo stuff? Or somebody that's like, wait, isn't that blockchain, that's Bitcoin. Isn't that the stuff they use for child trafficking or child pornography and human
Silk
trafficking?
Road,
And
that's what everyone thinks of, yes.
right. And that was in fact, the original name for my company was blockchain tickets. And I changed it to upgrade it because I got so tired of people automatically dismissing me or freaking out or thinking that I was somehow involved in the human trafficking when I'm selling a ticket to Beyonce. So I'm not sure what the connection is there, but somehow people thought that or found that. A year later, the cryptocurrency valuations blew up. Everybody got really excited about it. And it went from FUD to FOMO, the fear of missing out. So people had come up to me and it's like, oh my God, so you know blockchain? I'm like, yeah, now we're going to talk about tickets. And they're like, do I put the money in Bitcoin or do I put the money in Ripple? And I'm like, I'm not an investment advisor. I only have a little in for diversification purposes. I'm not the person to talk about it, but it got us in the door to a certain degree. And I feel like we're going through the second wave of that frothiness that happened in 2017. And my biggest complaint about 2017 is that I felt like the inflated valuations obscured the value of the technology because everybody was so wrapped up in like, I'm rich. The same way that in 1999, the value of what the internet was going to mean fundamentally for our lives and what a lot of these companies were going to do to change how we live was obscured by the fact that someone just bought a domain name for, you know, $20 and then turned around and got millions of dollars in funding because they owned, you know, whatever.com, cup.com, right? So the idea that that you have these crazy valuations, and I wish I could purely explain them, and I can almost explain a couple, but that's what I fear. I fear that it obscures the value of the technology. So I'll start by saying, I think the markets are potentially a little overpriced. I'm making a couple of dollars off it. I know a bunch of people probably put their stimulus checks in there. It kind of pains me. And yet at the same time, it's like, well, you made the money. But when it comes to the actual technology itself, when it comes to the core value of the technology, what the technology provides, I think it's absolutely enormous. And I saw this 8 years ago. I saw this 5 years ago when I started the company. I see it today, and I see it more so today in a lot of ways, because I think the technology is still maturing. And to talk first about the maturity of the technology real quick, and then I'll talk about where I think the application is. But what we have to remember is that blockchain didn't exist 13 years ago. It was literally in 2008 when the original white paper was written with basically a concept around how blockchain works. When you compare that to how old all these other technologies that we are excited about is, you know, how old those technologies are, you realize that we're really truly in the infancy of blockchain, right? So mobile phones were, you know, back in the 90s, even social networking was going on in the late 90s with Friendster and things like that. With Bitcoin, with the granddaddy of them all, that's 2008, right? So what we have to do, much like the brick cell phones that eventually became these tiny little things that are enormous computers, we have to be patient about how these things are going to evolve. When you look at Bitcoin, Bitcoin has a number of problems associated with it that concern me from a valuation perspective. It doesn't work as fast as you'd like. It takes up a whole lot of energy. Transactions are still kind of potentially expensive depending on what the going rate is on validating a transaction. There's just, you know, and what is a Bitcoin worth, right? You buy something for $10 in Bitcoin today, and suddenly you realize you paid $20 for it tomorrow because the valuation doubled, right? That's problematic, right? You don't want this sort of hyperinflation. The flip of it is that there is this next wave of technologies that are coming out that are very exciting. I mentioned I'm on the board of directors at MakerDow, and I think MakerDow is an example, you know, shameless plug alert, but yet not. But what I love about MakerDAO that I think is really exciting is that it does some of the things that are really important. It collateralizes the cryptocurrency, which is to say there is some collateral behind the creation of the cryptocurrency so that it's backed, so that there is some level of, hey, if I want to convert this back to fiat, there is something that is of value that is almost like a home equity loan to a certain degree, that you give the money out as a loan because you know there's a home behind that loan that you actually gave out. So that's one piece of it. And then it actually, the transaction is done with what's called a stable coin, where the value of the coin is pegged to the dollar. And when you do that, what you also do is say, okay, when I give $5, it is $5. Now that breaks a lot of the purity tests of a lot of cryptocurrencies. They're like, we hate fiat and we hate the US government and we hate quantitative easing. And it's like, yeah, but do you want to be practical, or do you want to do something that actually, or do you want to kind of, you know, kind of go back to some purity test that's absolutely meaningless in the grand scheme of things of, 300 million Americans and billions of people around the world, especially those who are unbanked and don't have a way to kind of necessarily be able to do economic things. There's a huge opportunity for that. So at the strict cryptocurrency level, the idea of overcoming boundaries, the idea of banking the unbanked, there's just so much opportunity. I'm just not sure if it's necessarily Bitcoin. Again, not investment advice. I don't give investment advice. I'm just not sure if I necessarily see it. When it comes to the smart contracts, when it comes to Ethereum and some of these ideas, even around NFTs, which is kind of the big deal right now, and we're working on something that's sort of the next generation of NFTs at Macrodemic, but the idea is a little bit more salient. I don't know if I buy into the pay millions of dollars for an image, but it is interesting because the fact that you can legislate the transfer and the ownership of that on a smart contract digitally is transformative, right? It's the same way that you can imagine the blockchain being responsible for a deed to a house, a deed to a car, medical records, credit records. There's a lot of places where there's a trust of information that needs to happen. You need a validation from certain sources, but you don't want it to sit on a centralized server. And for that, blockchain can be absolutely transformational. It just needs to get faster. It just needs to have lower latency, higher throughput. A lot of the technology will come around, just like those brick cell phones eventually turned into little tiny things that could fit in your, the Motorola razors that fit in your pocket that eventually become, well, maybe we went a little too far there. Let's bring it out to the iPhones. And now, we can't get off our phones. I believe that's going to happen with blockchain. And I don't know if that warrants the valuations that exist right now, but for the ones that survive it, much like how Google and Amazon survived the dot-coms, they're going to be transformative businesses.
Sandy, so I know that DeFi is sort of like this big wave that popped up, right? A lot of people are doing stuff in it. I've heard a lot of the theses for, why, and I think it makes a lot of sense. What do you see as like the next sort of category? Because I sort of view like, NFTs as a category now that people are pushing towards. Do you see like other sort of categories of applications for blockchain? Like I know like, like the metaverse, right? Which is something that a lot of people talk about is like another big thing that I know people are saying could be like the next big thing for it. So sort of like a, broad category of things, like you're trying to build stuff, like, do you think there's like other, sort of applications?
I do. I think the biggest next, if I were to predict the next wave, I think the biggest next wave is going to come to the bridging between the physical and the digital. Right now, when you think about cryptocurrency, it's not replacing anything physical. We think of money as physical, but in reality, when you get your direct deposit paycheck, you never actually see the dollars. It's not like the olden days where someone's like 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, here you go, here's your payment for the week. It's always been numbers and balances, and now we're just moving it to a decentralized sort of place. With NFTs, we're still dealing primarily with digital files, right? It's file ownership for a Beeple image, for a Rob Gronkowski token, or for a Top Shot. It's still digital. And the question is, at what point do we kind of come across that divide? So a house is on a blockchain, so that the physical painting is on the blockchain, and where Sotheby's and some of these auction houses can have a very clear picture of not only who owns it, but when was it owned, what was the history of the product. Again, baseball cards are kind of the famous analogy a lot of people use with digital collectibles, but the fact is that baseball cards still have a value, and there's still some question around the authenticity of each piece. And the idea that you can actually have some tether between what that physical piece is and the digital piece. I'll give the example. About 10 years ago, I needed to get a Christmas gift for my brother, a birthday gift, and he was a big Magic Johnson fan. I was a big Larry Bird fan. So I went on eBay and got him a framed picture signed of the two of them at an all-star game playing against each other many years earlier. I'm not 100% sure if those were real or fake signatures, right? It wasn't purely authenticated. There's no way I could kind of track the history of that item. It's just like, it's a seal that kind of looks like a hologram. How do you create sort of that digital, that physical piece, but connected to the digital so that there's something authentic on the item itself? And then there's the ability with the blockchain to look at it. And the only people that need to be involved in that scenario are the owner of the piece and the subsequent buyer of the piece. How do I look up a Basquiat because I want to find that Basquiat and I want to be able to make an offer on that, right? Suddenly the marketplace and the idea for these items, it's through the roof on what can happen there. Right now, we're just doing it with digital. We're scratching the surface on what can happen when we get to real items.
Hey, Sandy. So we talked about blockchain and a little bit about cybersecurity. Beyond that, what are the sectors that you're seeing as the kind of the more prominent sectors right now for VC investing?
Well, I think, and it's funny because there's VC investing, and I don't know, always agree with everything VCs kind of invest in. They had their scooter phase for a while, and that got a little annoying, and they went a little overboard with some of the ride share stuff, which technically still hasn't proven a profitable business model. But so I think there's opportunities that exist, and I'm not sure what the VCs will necessarily get really excited about. But I do think when I see some of the things that are out there right now and people getting excited about, let me back up. We're about to go through a really interesting situation because we're about to come out of a pandemic. It's not going to be a step function. We're going to slowly come out of it. And the question is going to be like, what's residual? What is going to come back that was once a thing in February of 2019 or 2020 and is now going to come back? And what is that third space, which are the other businesses that are going to be really valuable? So like, I can only imagine what health tech is going to have right now for us in terms of feeling more comfortable about kind of being out there, the same way that 9/11 caused security companies to kind of go through the roof. We had to create a Department of Homeland Security. That created a lot of funds, and a lot of companies kind of came out of that. So I do think the pandemic's going to drive a lot of where the VC funding is going to go. From my perspective, and what I kind of still get excited about, even outside of sports tech, but what I think is kind of interesting, I still feel like the concept of Internet of Things, the concept of connected devices, still has barely scratched the surface of where it can go. And I don't think we've come up with enough of sort of the connected devices that are out there that are going to make our life easier. So I have a Fitbit, and I take it off when I'm on Zoom calls because it counts too many steps because I gesticulate too much. But I have a Fitbit. I've been wearing these for 9 years, and it's amazing how much better they get and how much I'm learning about myself. What used to just be steps is now heart rate and SpO2 numbers and sleep, and not even sleep, but like REM sleep versus deep sleep versus. So I think there's a lot of things, and a lot of these interconnected devices. What I haven't seen that I think is going to happen, and I'll call it the mesh. Someone will eventually come up with a better word, but the idea of how do you take each of these interconnected devices and make them better? At South by Southwest a number of years ago, I remember, I think it was the CEO of Fitbit and the CEO of Nest were on the stage together, and they like gave an example. I think it was, I don't know if it was the CEOs, but it was representatives from each company. And the idea that, and now they happen to be both part of Google, I believe. You're going for a run, it's 90 degrees out, you're getting close to home, you're on that 6th mile, you're tired, you're sweating. What if the Nest does that and cranks up the AC, right? The idea that, and this is where artificial intelligence, really what artificial intelligence is the ability to preemptively sort of preset based on all these inputs that are coming in from the devices. Artificial intelligence is useless without enough inputs coming in and providing the data. I still feel like the ability to gather more and more data is an opportunity, especially as Moore's law is still a thing, even though it kind of stretches out a little bit more. The devices are going to get cheaper. The devices are going to get smaller. The devices in some cases are just going to be embedded not only in our phones and our watches, but who knows what else. I think that's where that's the one I keep an eye out for, because I feel like where blockchain's got its second wave right now, I don't feel like we've had the IoT second wave yet. And I feel like that's a technology that is going to be growing fast. And at some point, we're going to realize that the blockchain, which is great for holding and managing data, is still going to need more data to kind of filter in. That's one of the things that's happening in sports, going back to the ball can actually measure its own spin rate and bats can measure things. And like, what else is that going to mean just in walking down the street?
So thank you all for joining us, Sandy. Thank you so much for sharing your just incredible wealth of wisdom and being for just such an amazing example of a Cornell graduate, and all you do for the local community and the Cornell community, and just as a wonderful human in this world. We really appreciate you.